So here we go, Kinesiology 223, Chapter 2, book presentation number 2. Let's go ahead and jump on in. Last time we left off with differences between study and experiment, and I talked about the Hawthorne effect. You know, when you change one variable or when you change a variable, that suddenly becomes an experiment. Now, the book goes into, internal versus external validity, and I definitely want to take a moment to dig into this, and this looks like a lot going on here. But what you have is, we've talked about reductionism, right? So we're done with that. If we go into, when we look at internal validity and external validity, this is where you have to look at your experiment and go, all right, how valid are my results? How valid is the process? So when we talk about internal validity, that's within the context of the experiment itself. And it refers to how well a study is conducting and ensuring the results are due to the variables within the construct of the actual experiment. So like in the Hawthorne effect, they could attribute that the increase in worker performance was attributed to the change of lights because that particular area was the one area that was affected, and there was an increase in performance. And it's not due to external factors in terms of what these folks had for lunch, et cetera, and you can do things to minimize those variables. And with external validity, let's get myself out of the way here. You look at external validity, now it becomes a conversation of, well, just how applicable are my results? In this example, so for example, the Hawthorne effect, the results are applicable because now somebody else in another factory or another plant somewhere else can change a variable, whatever it may be, and experiment with that to be able to increase worker production. You can change the lights and increase worker production. And you can do that in your plant or another plant. The book itself is okay in terms of how they describe this, but I thought it was of benefit to be able to shine a light to this here and just go over it because there'll be some questions, no doubt, somewhere down the road regarding internal and external validity. Just remember, internal is internal and looking in at the actual study or experiment. The external validity is looking outward and how valid those results are within the environment itself. And keep in mind when you do a study, like if I do a study on speed, agility, quickness, or something in my field, it's going to resonate with people within my field and it'll be valid to people within my field. If I did a research on Olympic weightlifting and then I went and tried to submit it to some other organization, it would not have any real external validity. So it has to also resonate with the people that you want to resonate with, as we'll see here in a second. Okay, qualitative versus quantitative data. And in research and even in your day-to-day life, right? When you become a physical therapist, perhaps you'll be a personal trainer, perhaps a strength and conditioning coach, you're going to be constantly confronted with qualitative and quantitative data. Qualitative is, they describe it as data collected through interviews with an individual, focus groups, and observations, typically non-numerical in nature. And that's the key part, it's typically non-numerical. But I'll tell you, as a coach or physical therapist, movement practitioner of any variety, personal trainer, you'll end up evaluating a human body, a person doing an exercise or a movement pattern, and you'll offer cues and critiques to that person based off of what you've learned in your classwork and coursework to believe that it's a proper movement pattern and it's appropriate for what that person's trying to accomplish in terms of working their triceps or whatever it may be. But also you'll compare that body to an entire body of work that you have in working with thousands of people over thousands of hours over and over and over again. So you have like this catalog of movement that you compare and contrast the person in front of you with compared to your body of work, so to speak. But as you oftentimes go through and work with people, you try to find ways to quantify, and you find ways to take something out of the qualitative side of the house and bring it more to the quantitative side. And the quantitative side, it's more numerical in nature. It's more, if I were to say one's subjective and one's objective, the qualitative side is more subjective because you're reviewing that information and it's your own interpretation. The quantitative side is more absolute You can either power clean 315 or you can't. You can either earn, in this example, a rating of 7 points or not. You can be a 0 or 1. You can do a Likert scale from a 1 to a 5. It depends on what instrument you're trying to use. But I will say this. Oftentimes you try to move things from the qualitative side to the quantitative side, and sometimes it's difficult. If we look at an FMS screen, a functional movement screen, and you can look this up, I'm not going to bury you with these details. You have several movement patterns where a participant performs these movement patterns, and the strength conditioning coach, the physical therapist, or the personal trainer evaluates those movement patterns. So there's a qualitative component where I'm evaluating that movement pattern of my client compared to an entire body of work and what I view is appropriate, but also what is appropriate as per the FMS movement screen. You can then give the person 0 points for not being able to perform the movement or there's pain, or you can give them 3 points if they do it perfect. So what they're doing there is trying to take a qualitative evaluation of a particular movement, an overhead squat, for example, and offer a point value to it. And what they're really trying to do is you're trying to take something that's very subjective on the qualitative side when you evaluate that person's movement pattern, and you're trying to make it quantitative. And if you can make it quantitative, you can evaluate the data set, you can calculate the data set, and you can evaluate the data set. And that's really what they're after when you do something like that. Now, the book does a pretty good job about this in terms of being able to have like professional practice knowledge. And it's gained through experience. And I mentioned like you have this body of work. And I've even alluded to it a couple times when I talk about like my person doing tricep pushdowns, and I evaluate that client compared to an entire library of tricep pushdowns I've done with 1,000 different clients over thousands of hours. There's a bit of a continuum, if you will, though, when you talk about professional practice knowledge, and they use the example of scientific method is very absolute. It's very objective in nature. And then on the other end of that is intuition, where it's kind of just a gut feeling of if something's right or something's wrong. And so they have this continuum, and what they stress in here in the book is you have this kind of professional knowledge that comes from these different areas that include not only reading, reviewing, learning in books, but you have one-on-one experience when you're working with people. You'll have multiple experiences of working with multiple people. You'll be able to kind of review your own thoughts and experiences when you're working with someone, and then also just intuition, right? It's okay. I think this table does a pretty good job of really kind of taking that list and refining it in terms of scientifically derived and professional practice. And they talk about how on the scientific side it's very reliable. It's something that's unbiased. It's very objective. It is reductionistic, right? Because you're focusing on just one variable. Very much slow to evolve because you can only focus on one variable at a time. It's very much like you can't move to B until you finish A. You can't move to C until you finish B. So it's very much like that. You can only look at one variable. And with professional practice, a little more holistic. Like if I'm teaching running technique and I talk with somebody about the heel flick, where the heel comes up and actually hits the back of the butt to be able to help mechanically shorten the lever while running, totally different story. I can look at that and not just focus on the heel flick, but I can look at the heel flick and how it shortens the lever and allows the person to pull through a little bit faster, get a little bit higher knee lift as well as a vertical knee lift, as well as horizontal knee drive, and be able to then put the foot back down on the ground much faster. So I can look at all those variables together. It's not just the heel flick by itself. So professional practice has its place in, it's not like I just came up with the heel flick. That was scientifically derived and learned through different experiences that I had in my background. They use the model, and they talk about the model of the re-aim, which it almost sounds like you're in a business class when you talk about this. You start creating these data sets through research, and you have these studies that you do a study and then you do an experiment, and the research supports these different things. And you look at it and you go, okay, how is it implemented, right? And then with that, once it's actually in a program, those data points, how is it maintained within there? Who am I actually reaching out? What's the target population? Efficacy, how do I know it's working? Is there a way to actually evaluate if something's working or not? And then how do I develop this in terms of being able to deliver it into either my program, or if like I'm delivering research to coaches, how they can implement it into their coaching environment. Now, the sometimes, you have to look at this and go, you really have to evaluate who your end user is. A lot like in developing a marketing plan in a business class, you have to look at who the end user is, who the customer is. And when you do your research, you oftentimes write your research within like a little bubble, right? It's your own little space and place. But ultimately, you're writing that research for the benefit of somebody else. And that the benefit is then adopted into another person's program, or they actually use those research pieces to be able to run their own research. So it's kind of interesting in terms of how they were able to take this, what I view is very much like being in a marketing class, and then apply it into the research side, really have a grasp of what's the reach, the efficacy, the adoption, the implementation, and the maintenance, which are things that you think about when you start to put in like a marketing plan within a company, right? Who is it going to affect? Who is the end person? How effective is it going to be? The adoption, who actually uses it will be the coach or the athletes. How will it be implemented within the program itself? And then is it something that can be maintained over time? Can you do the same type of programming over time? Can you do the same type of research over time? These are very much things that you see and hear of when you start talking in terms of working with athletes or even working with your people in a physical therapy environment. Now, they do a pretty good job here, and they look at the compare and contrast of um, the scientific approach to sport, and the approach itself is kind of like a balance, and they start to allude to and get into the art of coaching, and that's really a sweet spot that I hope all of you kind of endeavor to get to, where you can take the scientific research, understand what is being presented to you as a practitioner from a researcher, and be able to actively apply it into your sport environment or your rehab environment with your athletes. Now, this is a great example when you talk about this gentleman who is a swim coach, and he sums up the need to consider, individuality when you start talking about working with athletes. And the model that we use in the industry itself is very much this. You train for overall athleticism first, then you train for the sport demands, then you train for the position demands, and then the athlete. So in athleticism, that's pretty broad-based. We can work with athletes and work on them becoming better athletes. Then football is different than baseball, than basketball, then soccer is different than wrestling. And then you can work on a particular position. Pitchers are different than catchers and first basemen than outfielders, right? And then the particular athlete, if they have an injury per se, you can work around that injury, or if they have their own psychological components and anxiety issues that we'll talk about here in the next couple of presentations. But you can start to develop your programming more towards the athlete. So I think this does a really good job in the book of kind of encapsulating how you have to use the scientific side to work on things, but you also have to have the art of coaching to understand how to implement some of these things depending upon who's in front of you. So the science really focuses on general principles, and the art is recognizing when and how to individualize these to the person. That's the sweet spot. I'm going to go ahead and break it up here, and I'm going to jump into the next presentation. So you guys have a good one. I'll be right back.